Hi, everyone. So, this week we are reading some new women poets and writers. And today I want to just walk through the people we'll be reading and giving you some background to those authors as well as their works. So, starting off on Monday, we are reading Xantippe by Amy Levy. Xantippe is a poem which imagines Socrates' wife on her deathbed, looking back at her life. There's very little source material, a few mentions of Xantippe throughout some of the classic writers, but for the most part, this is Levy imagining what it would be like to be the wife of, the great Greek philosopher Socrates. And the way that she imagines that also also shines a light on what it was like to be and how hard it was to be an educated woman in Victorian society as well. She herself was highly educated. She was the first Jewish woman to attend the college that she attended at Cambridge. And really, very few women attended Cambridge to begin with. She's progressive on her thoughts on gender. Xantippe, as we see, is fairly progressive and was written during her time at Cambridge. She was very aware of and sometimes expressive of her attractions to other women, especially literary women in letters, although we aren't aware of any relationships she may have had. Um, Levy struggled with bouts of depression, a topic that sometimes appears in her poetry, and mental illness would eventually claim her life. She left behind a great wealth of literature and scholarship, though, that was really respected by literary men and women alike. For Wednesday, I'm having you read three poems by Michael Fields, which is the name chosen by an aunt and niece who collaborated together on their writing. Catherine Bradley, aunt, and Edith Cooper, niece, were 16 years apart in age and very close from the moment of Edith's birth. As her aunt Catherine traveled and studied, she kept in close contact through letters. Eventually, their friendship became romantic. While this might seem shocking from a modern perspective on a few different levels, it's worth noting that relationships were a bit different in the 19th century. Cousins commonly did get married. And age differences were less of a big deal. We know at least that friends in their literary circles seem to accept their relationship, especially those who were also in relationships with members of their same sex. So, not that that has to dictate our modern reaction, but hopefully that's a little helpful in terms of contextualizing their relationship within the Victorian era. Um, so Bradley and Cooper started writing together as Michael Field, and their first play met with astonishingly positive reception. There's even talk about this mysterious Michael Fields man becoming poet laureate someday. But when their identities as two women and not one man was made public, the enthusiasm did die down a bit. Um, Educated women of this time, I'm moving now to subject matter. Educated women of this time were especially interested in the female centered aspects of certain moments in Greek mythology and religion. We already saw that a little bit from Augusta Webster, who was not. Would not have been considered a new woman, disagreed with their politics. But we really see that going into much more deeply through Michael Fields and then also Vernon Lee, who we'll be reading this week. So, whereas educated men often turn to Plato to justify their love for other men, women like Bradley and Cooper imagine themselves to be neo-maiads, who were the female acolytes of Dionysus. They were interested in the writings of Sappho. One of the poems that we're reading this week is inspired by one of Sappho's fragments. Um, Another poem was written after their dog, Wim Chow, passed away. I mention this because that context is helpful as you read that poem to know that that's the context. I also think it's interesting because at this point they had converted to Catholicism, but I think it's interesting how they rework Catholic theology a little bit in order to make space for their female centered love for one another. On Friday, we're going to discuss a story by Vernon Lee. Vernon Lee was the masculine name chosen by the woman born Violet Paget. It was the name that she preferred to use not only as a pen name, but also increasingly as she got older in her everyday life. When I was doing manuscript research, I came across the letters in which her female friends expressed how much they enjoyed her company in private, but how they would sometimes cut short time with her in public because she failed to conform to feminine mannerisms. One letter talked about her lurid speech. Um, I suspect that in many ways she intentionally sought to act masculine. I think that's definitely true from what we know of her romantic relationships, which were likely asexual. But she did have two significant relationships, romantic relationships with other women. Lee grew up in a family that traveled a lot. She spent much of her life in France and especially Italy. Her father was a tutor, and so she learned a lot from him. She was also self taught a lot of what she knew. The world of art criticism was very new. Really, in many ways, what we think of as art criticism is an invention of the 19th century. But Verna Lee quickly became one of the respected voices in that field. Her experience in Italy allowed her to write about the Renaissance with a level of extensive firsthand experience that few men who were writing in English at the time possessed. She also wrote many stories which were not only a-religious, like the writings of Amy Levy, or pagan, like the early writings of Michael Fields, but were actively anti Christian. And that's something that we will see play out in the story that we read this week a little bit. Being a woman in the Victorian era meant having the very idea of your sexuality questioned. Women were supposed to be uninterested in sex outside of procreation and pleasing their husbands, and sexologists created medical classifications, as we've discussed, for women who actually had strong sexual appetites. This obviously created significant challenges for all women who sought to understand or express their own sexuality. At the same time, though, it did mean that romantic relationships between women tended to be under less scrutiny than romantic relationships between two men. The biggest challenge to female homoeroticism really was privacy. As unmarried women usually lived with family, that meant that it was hard to have your own space and, be outside the surveillance of that family. But independent women of means were able to support themselves and their partners, and they could live lives that might be called eccentric, but were rarely considered criminal. So, Wednesday's article will fill us in more on the history and theory behind Victorian homoeroticism. I think both male and female. I might try to give a little bit more context for both of those than what we've gotten so far. But this week, I don't want to just focus on expressions of or conversations about sexuality throughout these poems and story. I also want to focus on the commentary that they make on Victorian gender from a new woman perspective. So, really looking forward to seeing what you say in the discussion forums, and then especially looking forward to seeing you on Friday on Zoom and talking about Prince Albert and the Snake Lady. All right, have a good week, and as always, reach out if you've got questions. Bye.